Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this podcast. This is Mike Burns, Managing Director in our Enterprise Cloud for Protiviti, and today we're going to talk a little bit about migrations and what determines successful migrations over failed migrations. I'm joined here today by Sam Hoare and Habib Al-Alam, who are part of our Global Enterprise Cloud team at Protiviti, and we're going to talk a little bit about today kind of the way that AWS and the way Protiviti works to define successful migrations by using that working backwards formula. And that is by defining what success looks like to start with. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for joining and hope you find this useful information. And I'm going to turn it over to Sam to talk about why organizations struggle with migrations.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, I think there's a direct correlation there, right? So often we don't achieve success because we did a poor job of defining it. And I'll give an example of a client who had migrated their critical workloads to public cloud, and they had another program plan that we wanted to support them with to migrate their remaining workloads to cloud. And as part of building the business case, they were being asked to articulate the value delivered in that initial migration. But because they hadn't clearly defined their success criteria, this was pretty challenging. We talk about benefits of cloud like resiliency, availability, automation, and so on. But if you haven't defined your goals, your North Star, like this client, they didn't collect any metrics. So it was difficult to demonstrate, yeah, we've got better uptime. We're having less outages when you can't compare pre-migration to post-migration. So of course, we helped them with defining the value they were seeing in the cloud and building the case for that next migration. But it's not an ideal spot to be in. So yeah, absolutely. First things first, define your goals up front. And as part of that, it's crucial that there's a shared understanding of those goals. If your security folks, your migration team, your app teams, finance, the board, if everyone's on a different page and wants different things out of the migration, you're in for a world of hurt. And this happens. So I'd also say like those goals, right? The reason this matters is because that's going to inform so many of your decisions, whether it's architectural decisions, operational, security, and more. And I'll give another example of, say you need to move out of a data center by a specific date. Your contract might be up, whatever it is. That migration will look very different to a client that wants to leverage some of the automation capabilities in the cloud. For example, DevOps practices and a CI/CD pipeline. For that first organization where you need to be out of the data center, maybe you lift and shift, you rehost, right? You move as quickly as you can into the cloud as is, and then you look at modernizing later. For an organization that wants automation, probably doesn't make sense to rehost. You'd want to be pretty selective and deliberate in terms of what you migrate and how you transform it, so you're seeing those benefits immediately. So that's key things, right? Define success, and if you do a good job there, hopefully you'll achieve it, or at least you've taken the first step in the right direction.
I like the point that you brought out there, especially around lift and shift, right? Because lift and shift, we see less and less of really just moving assets to the cloud, operating like a data center in the cloud. And there's, a handful of examples that we could provide, but in particular, it especially happens in organizations that lift and shift and have heavy business requirements for really data intensive or image processing type that needs to be delivered in real time, and how that turns into a failed migration because they roll it back and say we're better off on-prem because, you cannot overcome the physics of, introducing distance that introduces latency. And those are some of the things that we kind of alluded to in the beginning of, working backwards and planning what your result is going to be and what your business expectation is for, my operations either have to get better or they have to be at least the same. And then I can optimize while I'm there. And the challenge sometimes is that organizations move everything right away. They lift and shift first, then they go to modernization and transformation and optimization later. And what happens is the business doesn't really support it. And they have what is termed a failed migration at that point, even though technically everything migrated over and is operating in the cloud. That is success born from technical, but from the business perspective, it is not a success. It's a failed operation. And I think that's some of the things that we really want to get into is, what is and why is it so important? And in that working backward scenario, that business is involved from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Mike. And like that's another reason these things fail, right? So you haven't defined your success up front, poor application discovery and migration planning, and then lack of support from the various stakeholders, right? I think that's what you're touching on there.
Yeah, it is. It's the app support, and I think Habib, you've done numerous migrations and cloud migrations, and I know you've got some experiences where, especially dealing with the app teams that don't necessarily support the change, they don't want to move to the cloud, and or they move reluctantly. And if you could talk a little bit about that, I'd really like to hear about some of the challenges.
Yes, and definitely. First, thank you for having me. And yes, support from the business or the application team is very important. I've seen it happen when the stakeholders start skipping discovery workshops, for instance, during the project, simply because they're not convinced of the actual benefits of moving to the cloud. This would derail the project and wreak havoc on the timeline. On the other hand, we've seen completely the opposite results in cases where the business had fully embraced the migration, because more support from the business means more cooperation from different stakeholders, and hence silos would be easily resolved and migration can flow more smoothly. Therefore, it's very important to have a solid business case showcasing the benefits of migrating to the cloud, both from a technical and business perspective, to make sure that all stakeholders are convinced that migrating actually makes sense. And once they're convinced, then we can have their support throughout the migration. Also, as Sam touched on, good planning is very important in the cloud. For example, I once had a customer who wanted to migrate a server from their data center to the cloud. And this server was a kind of a supercomputer running some form of data analytics and machine learning and so on and so forth. And it had very high compute and storage capacity. In that case, if we had to actually match those super requirements in terms of compute and storage, then running that server in the cloud would cost the customer more than running it in the data center. Hence, in such cases, we would recommend that the customer would re-architect their platform first before moving it to the cloud. Otherwise, the migration would be a failure later on. In other cases, the server would be running some old legacy operating system which is not supported in the cloud. In that case, the customer would need to upgrade that OS before migrating to the cloud, and so on. In some other cases, the customer would need more control over the hardware, or might have special hardware requirement which is not found currently in some cloud platform, but found in another cloud platform, or might need to comply with specific security standards, and so on. Um, Sometimes also it might not depend only on the technology factor. Sometimes it's the people factor. For example, if the team does not have the skills to operate their platform in the cloud, then that's definitely a blocker. In that case, the team's skills should be uplifted before we can start migrating workload. Our team in Protiviti can work closely with the customer and help them identify those gaps from the outset and before embarking on their cloud journey.
There's some interesting conversation in here going on, and that always piques my interest. And what we start talking about, it's very technical. I like when you related the fact too, if you have, supercomputing type resources on-prem that are very difficult to match in the cloud in some instances. And when you look at that, we always talk a lot about the technical side of things. And then we look at testing. We'll go in and we'll do our technical validation. There's also the business verification testing that really kind of makes the difference of whether it's a real valuable migration or whether it's okay, it just sort of works. And Sam, why don't we talk a little bit about the business verification testing? Because everybody knows you have to technically validate and verify that the servers are working, but that the business side is where a lot of heat comes in, where people aren't really happy with the end results.
Yeah, let me give a bad example first. So I was speaking with a colleague. Wasn't our migration, but they were working with a client who had recently migrated to the cloud. They were saying, "Hey, it didn't work. The migration was a failure. Why did we do this in the first place?" And it was a medical imaging app, and the users needed to run the scan and see the images instantaneously. That's what they were used to when the infrastructure was running on-prem. As part of the migration, this whole business use case had been lost along the way. There wasn't formalized business verification testing. And so the data was being uploaded to a region far away. There was serious latency, like 15 seconds from when they run the scan to when they can look at it. So it has to go across the country, back to the country to their work where they're working on so they can visualize it. And it's an absolute failure. There's no way you want to degrade the end user experience in a migration. And I'll give maybe a more positive example where your users might not even be your immediate customers. When I was previously part of the Australian cloud team with Habib, we did a lot of work for big governments, and often other government agencies use the applications. They might be the end users as well as all these dependent agencies as well. And so we had to identify those and figure out what did the agencies rely upon? What data did they need? What did success look like to make sure all the right stakeholders were involved in that business verification testing?
Yeah, sounds an awful lot of like having proper governance flying over the top of the projects. Well, let's talk a little bit about that governance. Talk about things like, you go through architectural review boards, you go through steering committee, things like that. The value and the importance of why those are there and how many different types of meetings there are to affect change, sometimes often in the middle of migration, so that you do produce a successful migration where you determine there may be failure on the horizon.
Yeah. So program governance, it's really important, right? Let's assume you've done a good job defining your success criteria, you've done discovery and planning justice. And some of this is just basic program and project management hygiene. Things like you need a plan, you need good communication with all your stakeholders, you need to be able to identify and manage your risks, your issues, your dependencies. And a really big part of that is defining those structures and responsibilities, right? Who needs to make decisions? Who do you need to regularly report status and issues to? And how do you pivot? Even the best laid plans will go wrong. And when it goes wrong, how do you make a change? And I'll give the example of change approval boards. We've had organizations where previously they said, hey, we have CAB, it's once a month on a Tuesday. And then if the right people are sick, they don't turn up, or you just push things down for another month. That's not going to work for a migration, right? You need to be a lot more responsive, a lot more agile. You might have an application that's planned to migrate on Thursday or Friday, and suddenly there's an outage the app team needs to respond to, and they need to patch a critical security vulnerability and they can't migrate then. If you've done a good job of this, you'll have backup applications, teams you can communicate with to change the plan, as well as a much more agile approvals process. Who needs to make the decision to say, yes, this application can migrate instead? Who needs to approve the change? And then how do you pull the right people together on the day of to execute the migration? And I think a part of governance is also that roles, responsibilities, and steps that are much more granular detail. And that's where whenever we Protiviti will help execute a migration, we use really detailed migration runbooks. Who's doing what? When is it happening? What's the order? And what's our acceptance criteria for each step? How do we know that we succeeded and we're ready to move on to what's next? And Habib, I know you've compiled a lot of these, been in the room and ran a lot of these migrations. Is there anything you want to add on run books and the importance there?
We can't stress enough the importance of having a comprehensive runbook covering all the information needed to execute a migration. Basically, this document should be communicated to all stakeholders who should be able to review and refine it, not just during planning phase, but throughout the whole migration cycle. In addition to the runbook, and since we're talking about discovery and planning and governance, uh, there are many factors basically that are very important to have a successful migration. A successful migration depends on a solid discovery phase, and there are many factors that can contribute to the success of that migration. As we said, it's very important, for instance, to understand and work out the application dependencies. An application can be dependent on other applications while being itself a dependency for some applications. Therefore, it is important to maintain those links as the application is being migrated. Otherwise, something would break after the migration. In addition, being able to test the migration beforehand is another success factor. Like, for example, running pilot migrations. It helps us know what to expect during an actual migration and resolve potential gaps in our migration tools in advance, which saves us lots of time. And of course, it goes without saying that post-migration testing is crucial to verify a migration success. Like as Sam, you already talked about business verification test. It's very important to after the migration is done and after the technical verification tests are successful, it's very important to engage the business team and make sure that all the business functionalities of a specific application are basically passing health checks after the migration. On the other hand, communication with the application business owner is important to understand when would be the best time to schedule the migration, as you already touched on, Sam. We should be able to schedule the migrations outside peak business hours in order to mitigate the business disruptions as much as possible. In addition, the information captured during pilot migrations, as mentioned earlier, can help us identify the outage time window required for the migration so we can plan accordingly. In addition, whether we like it or not, some migrations might not run as expected for some reason or the other. Therefore, it is of paramount importance to factor in some planned space for a rollback in terms of time and effort required. So yeah, successful migration depends on a solid discovery and planning phase in order to make sure that we wouldn't stumble at some point during the project.
Yeah, and I think I'd love, that finally on the tail end of the migration is, we talk about run, it's that hypercare and handover. Most organizations, a migration can feel an awful lot like it's being done to them, not with them together, because generally they come in and ask an organization to come in and, really run the migration. You're interacting with their teams, but they're not embedded in the migration work themselves. It's being done by an outside organization like Protiviti, but it's that hypercare and handover, executing with the run books so that they actually understand this is the new environment. This is the operating environment that you're now in, and ensuring that before it's handed over to them to execute, they now are doing it. They're capable of running it on their own without us being involved. And then we're ready to turn it over to them. And I know that we have some significant amount of experience in, hypercare and handover, and even executing beyond that and turning that into managed service. If the organization's not really comfortable managing the environment.
Yeah, and maybe Mike, I'll speak at the high level first, and Habib, you can give like a granular example. I know you've helped with hypercare issues, but I think firstly, it's right hypercare, and who's there to help. So making sure there's a defined period of hypercare, and we've got one of our engineers and a business analyst on hand if anything does go wrong, and that stretches from the lower environments to production, right? Hopefully, you're identifying and working out a lot of those kinks in the lower environments first, but you still need hypercare post migration because it is a serious change. And then I think in terms of handover, that's where you really need an operating model. Who is going to support these workloads? And your operating model will change depending on the architecture of those workloads and the IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS, depending on how you want to structure your workloads, but you need to define what they're going to do. And as you alluded to, Mike, we can help with managed services, right? If you haven't figured that out yet. But if you do know, if you know who's going to support these workloads in production, it's great to involve them during the migration process. And we'll do that as much as we can, partnering with network engineers, sysadmins, cloud operations as well. Get them involved in some of the migration steps where it makes sense. Get them involved in hypercare and some of that issue resolution. So when there is handover, it's not just flipping a switch and saying, we're done with this, you're on your own, but it's a really seamless transition where they've been on the journey. It hasn't just been done to them, and they feel really comfortable supporting these workloads in cloud.
Yes, actually, speaking of hypercare, like one example immediately comes to my mind on one specific migration in Sydney, Australia. After migrating the application, and after the application succeeded and passed all business and technical verification tests, during that high care period, we received a call from the customer that their application, for one reason or the other, stopped working as it should. It was running slow. After deep investigation, we found out that as the load on the application started increasing, the application started hitting some technical limits in the cloud. And these bottlenecks basically weren't showing while we were doing the technical verification test and the business verification test because the amount of load on that application wasn't high enough. So after some investigation, we had to tweak some parameters in order to provide more capacity to that application so that it would run as it was running before the migration. So yeah, during the hypercare period, we would continue we call it an on-call mode with the customer. And we keep close eye, we keep on monitoring the customer's application to make sure that it wouldn't break and that it would still working as it's supposed to and the performance, the business user experience wouldn't be affected after the migration.
Yeah, thanks, Habib. That's great. I love the examples that we've been able to provide here today because these are real world. These are things that clients that you're learning lessons as we perform, and clients learn so that they can do when they go to the next phases and then go to do more and additional, whether it's transformation, optimization, or back to square one and migrating if they haven't completed their data center migrations. These are all lessons learned. They're valuable lessons learned to transit to successful migrations in the future. So I think we've covered a lot of topics here, what migration looks like and what a successful outcome would look like, and defining that outcome before. AWS provides tremendous amount of tools that help in the automation capabilities of doing migrations, and also funding. There's the Migration Acceleration Program that allows organizations to get some funding and move their workloads into AWS. It's a tremendous thing for everyone who doesn't love free cash, right? But anyway, that is part of the successful journey. When we talk about that, migration is expensive. It's not easy. It costs a lot, but AWS is your partner, Protiviti is your partner, and we can help secure that MAP funding that will help, kind of defray some of the costs of that. That's what's important. That is part of defining that success. And what is success? It's a term that we use in the consulting industry. We show you what good looks like. And that's kind of what we did here today in the podcast, to give a little bit of a taste of what does good look like when you're doing a migration. And also at the same time, what does failure look like, so that you can try to avoid some of those landmines in the future. So to wrap it all up, I thank Sam and Habib for joining us today. And we hope that you found the information that we've shared today beneficial. And we look forward to talking with people in the future. Thanks so much.